And it's my pleasure to introduce the first speakers, Nicola Di Girolamo, who will talk about prevalence of honorary authorship according to different authorship recommendations and contributor role taxonomy statement. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you for letting me present the results of our study here at the Peer Review Congress. As many of you know, honorary authorship is a daunting problem of publication science. And there are a lot of surveys published on honorary authorship, and we try to look at this problem from a different perspective. So from looking at what the actually authors declared in terms of their contributions. So first of all, we have to realize that there are a couple of different recommendations currently out there on authorship. One of them is published by the ICMJE, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. And the other one that you see on the right of the slide is an actual modification of these recommendations published on the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science by Dr. McNutt and colleagues. These two recommendations are pretty similar, though there are a few little differences. As you can see in this slide, we have summarized the ICMJE criteria and the science-wide or McNutt criteria in 4 different criteria. The third and fourth criteria are actually the same for both the recommendation and are about final approval and accountability about the manuscript. While the first 2 criteria are also quite similar with just a couple of subtle differences. In the science-wide recommendation, it was added a specific item about creation of new software, which didn't change much the recommendation by itself. But more than that, what changed the recommendation was the fact that and between the first criteria and the second criteria in the ICMJE became an or between the first and the second criteria in the science-wide recommendation. And these very easily created the fact that if you have drafted the work or substantially revised it, you could, even if you haven't done that with the science-wide criteria, you could have been a co-author. In addition to the general problem of honorary authorship, we also were concerned about a more specific problem, which is supply authorship. We define that supply authorship, which is basically the idea that you have probably heard of some colleagues or other scientists that have been included in research just by providing materials or funding. We don't know about the extent of this process in science. And so one of the 2 objectives of this study was to assess the prevalence of supply authorship. The second objective was to assess the prevalence of honorary authorship and compare the prevalence of honorary authorship depending on these 2 sets of recommendation. Many of you are aware of the CREDIT. CREDIT is an acronym that stands for Contributor Role Taxonomy, and is basically a set of items, 14 items, that are fundamentally potential action that a person can make in order to be part of a study. And these credit items are now widely available in different publishers, and so these are a great resource. We did a cross-sectional evaluation of these credit statements, obtaining data from the PLOS, the Public Library of Science journal articles from July 2017 to October 2021. And then we had 2 investigators that evaluated these authorship recommendation that we just discussed earlier and created a logical operation with and or between different credit items in order to kind of realize whether authors were supposed to be authors or not. So in the slide, you can see this is the final spreadsheet with the different logical operations that were developed. There is one for the ICMJE, one for McNutt from one of the investigator. From the other investigator did the same independently, and then this was discussed, and a third investigator acted as an arbiter in case of disagreement. We ended up with this logical operation for the ICMG criteria. Basically, the third and fourth criteria could not be evaluated using credit items because they don't, the approval and agreement to be accountable basically are not credit items. But the first and second criteria where we were able to verify them, and this is the operation that was used to verify them. As you can notice, most of the different items were connected by an OR. And then the item number 13 and 14, which are the two items related to writing the paper or revising the paper, were also connected by OR, but between the first criteria and the second criteria, there was an AND. For the science-wide recommendation, basically the concept is exactly identical, with the only actual difference that between the first set of criteria and the second set of criteria, which is basically writing and revising the paper, there was an OR instead of an AND. These are our results. We evaluated 630,000 credit statements from about 80,000 articles. And we found that 35% of the contributors were supposedly honorary authors if considering the ICMJE definition of authorship. Based on the science-wide definition of authorship, 3.6% of the contributors were honorary authors. You can see the difference between these percentages in the graph, and you can see that over the following years from 2017 to 2021, there was a small but significant decrease in honorary authorship in both the using both the recommendations. Looking a little bit more in detail on what were the potential factors that actually contributed to the disagreement between these two recommendations, we found that the disagreement between the two recommendations decreased over time. And also we found that disagreement between the two recommendations was more pronounced for non-medical journal, which is not surprising because the ICMG is supposed to be for medical journal. And in terms of supply authorship, what we found is that there were about 9,000 contributors that only provided either material or funding to studies on the data set. That accounted for about 1.3% of the total. This percentage decreased from 2017 to 2019, but remained unchanged from 2019 to 2021. And it was more pronounced in medical journals than in non-medical journals, though one specific medical journal, PLOS Medicine, had almost no supply orders at all. So this study has several limitations. We included only one publisher so far. This is an open access journal, the publisher, so potentially the generalizability of our results may be limited to the entire science. So we already have obtained data from another large publisher, Wiley, and discussing obtainment of additional data with Elsevier, and whoever is interested of providing us these statements, we are very happy to get them. In terms of the use of credit statements, of course, there are some inherent limitations with this. In fact, to our understanding, most of the credit statements in the different journals are provided just by the corresponding author. And so it will be interesting to contact a sample of co-authors of the corresponding author to make sure that the corresponding authors was actually saying the truth about the contribution, and all the co-authors actually were happy of the contribution that were stated in the article. And finally, although we agreed on the logical operations that we ended up developing, and even if we didn't have time to talk about this, we did some sensitivity analysis that proved that adding or removing small criteria, small credit roles wouldn't change much the results of the study. There were some criteria that were not verified, such as approval and accountability for the study. So in conclusions, we think that it's important that we focus on developing consensus on core tasks to qualify for authorship, and that potentially these core tasks are widely applicable in the whole science. In fact, we have seen that just applying a seemingly minor edit in the guidelines, in the recommendation from the ICMG created substantially different authorship criteria. In addition to this, we found that honorary authorship is still extremely common, even when self-declared basically by the authors, which implies that there is perhaps a misunderstanding both from the authors and from the editors about this practice. Perhaps potential action to fix this problem could be to flag authors immediately at the time of submission that actually do not fulfill minimum criteria for authorship. This way, the editors could establish a conversation with the research team. And finally, we found that a small percentage, 1.3% of the contributors were supply authors. Though this percentage is small, it's perhaps important that we start thinking about these persons, and we try to understand as both funding agency, editors, and authors, whether we want people that just provided materials or funding to be rightfully co-authors of an article or not. And with this, I thank you, my co-authors, and if you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Thank you, and you were perfectly on time. So we are going to go to questions. I don't see anybody lined up at the microphones yet. Michael, do we have a question from the virtual audience?
Nothing yet online.
Nothing yet. So while you get the your thinking hat on for questions, I will just take the opportunity to put a plug here for the credit taxonomy, which has recently become an ISO ANSI standard. I think that's something that has been needed for the continued stewardship and improvement of this taxonomy. I think this study highlighted how important it is to understand authorship in journals. And so if you want to participate in maintaining that, there will be workshops organized by NISO starting later this month, which are open to everyone to improve the credit taxonomy. We'll go to the first question here. Please introduce yourself, name and affiliation before your question.
Hi, Kristin Inman, Environmental Health Perspectives, National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences. Mine is less of a question, I think, and more of a comment or a discussion starter, I don't know, but I would argue that in addition to putting it on the journals, right, to identify authors that maybe don't meet the minimum criteria, particularly for those high volume journals where, you know, it could be hard to monitor. I think we need to also be educating authors and PIs and the people out there, because it's very easy to kind of go in and change your, you know, what you added to the paper. Now we want to think that people aren't doing that, but at some level we only have so much control over this as journals. So that's just my comment, my thought.
Yeah, thank you very much for the comment. And yeah, we absolutely agree. I think this is such a serious issue that would be, you know, need to be taken over from different perspectives. So from perhaps bottom to middle ground to the top. In my opinion, considering that we have still this very high percentage of honorary authorship, so there is the need of getting something done as soon as possible, which of course educating all the people that have been, you know, inserting their names into articles over time can be something, but at a certain point we will need to, you know, kind of find a way to end this process. I feel like we have started working on this project specifically because it's especially difficult for, you know, younger people that get into publication, you know, understand who should be a co-author and who not, and a lot of power dynamics are involved into that. And so I feel like for a co-author, it's hard to tell another person, maybe a senior author, you shouldn't be a co-author of this manuscript. You haven't done enough. Well, maybe for an editor, it could be a little easier at a time to say, hey, maybe, you know, you haven't done enough to be a co-author.
Thank you very much. Michael, we have a question from the virtual.
Yeah, I'm going to combine two, if I may. Jack Andrews asks, do you know the proportion of honorary authors under ICMJE criteria that only had a contribution to the first versus the second criteria set? And then there's general questions from D. Peter and Gerben Turiet about incentives and disincentives for truthful reporting. What and how those can be enforced.
So the first question is the prevalence of authors that just fulfill the first criteria. That basically if I remember well, and of course, I'm not gonna give any number right now, but if I remember well, that should be, no, that's not exactly the number of the, so no, I don't remember by, by memory, but hopefully we'll get these published soon, so we can answer to that question more precisely. And what's the second question again?
Just about incentives for truthful reporting, disincentives for untruthful reporting, and how to enforce the criteria.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. That's what we have been thinking about in the last, few months working on this project. How do we ensure that, these criteria are actually enforced? And one important thing is that if you tell an author, look, you haven't done enough to be a co-author, they could just go back and change the credit item and put, oh yeah, I revised the paper actually, or I drafted the original. So of course, we always have to rely on the, on the honesty and hopefully work on that. But yeah, of course, if someone is lying about what they have done, there isn't much we can do about that.
Thank you.
Point
I'll
of
go to
privilege, just
Anna.
point of privilege, sorry. Answer to the question, we did a study on this that's published in the BMJ based on major medical journals, honorary authorship, based on ICMJE criteria. Our percentage proportion was 17.6%. I put that in the chat.
Thanks,
very
Annette.
much.
Anna.
Okay, thanks. Anna Marušić, University of Split of Croatia. Thank you for your presentation. It's interesting to see that the field didn't change much, the problems with authorship from the studies that we done in 2000s, where we showed that the way you ask will influence the reporting of authorship. And I liked your recommendations, but I would like to add one, which is that it perhaps shouldn't be, only about the journals, but it should go early in planning research and should be a part of a protocol for research. Maybe that's where the intervention would work if you include definitions of authorship in registries and emphasize the importance of this, because this is something that has to be followed. And it's very difficult in a real world to make conclusions from what people report. We have shown in randomized trials that it's not reliable, and depending on the size of the group, the reporting of authorship would be different. So it's a much more complex problem where not only, the credit can help, but I think it has to go much earlier into the research process. Thanks.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. We completely agree that this is a problem that, we should start working from, from the base. We have tried to have actually dean of some university carry on surveys inside the university with to the PhD students on their perception of honorary authorship, and we have found a lot of barriers into that. So it's definitely a very emotional topic too sometimes.
Thank you. We'll go to this microphone.
Hi, I'm Nihar Shah, Machine Learning and Computer Science from Carnegie Mellon University. And my question is to think about from the point of view of the funders or funding agencies. Do they look at these authorship contributions from the PIs? And should they look, and how should they treat it? Especially for PIs who might potentially be playing the primary or only role of just getting the funding.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, it's a great question. Like, I think funding agencies should look at the specific contribution of each person listed into a potential grant, and perhaps that's not done enough yet.
I think we have time for one, maybe two questions, depending on how it is. So that might-
I'm actually going to yield because he was there before me.
Oh, okay, Steve.
Okay, I'll ask question quickly. Steve Goodman, Metrics and Stanford. There are many sciences, particularly the life sciences, but I think it's true across the board, where honorary authorship is expected. That is, the PI of the lab, the research group for which they often has the name, it's assumed that they will be on that paper, regardless of whether how does this penetrate? Because that is part of the political and academic economy of writing papers in these sciences. So you can show these criteria, but it looks like you have three eyes when you present it to this group, because that's the way they operate. So they don't view it as a transgression of any sort. This is the way it's done. How is that countered?
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. The problem is that this is already our culture sometimes is to have the principal investigator perhaps not doing much into the specific manuscript or the specific research project and being grandfathered into the publication. And I think that the only way to fix that, I mean, there are a lot of different ways, education and more commitment and perhaps journal policies, but sometimes perhaps even coming from above the principal investigator. So perhaps academic institutions should focus more on that and try to, of course, it's against their it's against their intent because they want more publications coming out. But you know, it's that's why it's a complex project, and we should work on every different level about that.
Last word here.
I'll be very brief. Theo Bloom from BMJ. In the distant past, when I was a graduate student, my lab head didn't put himself on the papers. So you would have graduate students with single author papers, but the granting agency decided that they couldn't be accounted from his grant unless his name was on it. So there are sort of incentives really embedded in the system, not just that's how it works, but you're actually required, if you're going to use funding from this grant, to put the PI's name on it.
Yeah,
I also think that the discipline specific norms that exist are actually quite important. And I think that the transparency that we're starting seeing with things like credit taxonomy is going to be very important to shed light on that.
Yeah, it sounds that from all the different comments, there is basically we have to work on this on every different level because everyone has different experience of honorary authorship, and we definitely there won't be just a single way to fix this problem.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.